Hey everybody, welcome back to Time to Talk. Today is actually November 5th, 14th, 13th. It's the unlucky day.
13th.
Yes, it is. Imagine that. We released an episode right near Halloween, and now we're recording on Friday the 13th. I don't know. What is up with this, Grace?
Well, and the fact is, neither of us have even actually seen that movie.
No, I don't.
I have no idea what it's even about.
Beyond Friday the 13th, and probably lots of people die gruesomely.
Oh yeah, I think it's a horror film, or suspense film, something in that genre.
Anyway, so according to our last episode, we should have released one on November 6th, right after the election. And honestly, part of it was just we were busy and kind of forgot that we had an episode to record. The other part of it is neither one of us wanted to record one that week.
Yeah.
I mean, we still didn't have any sort of election results until Friday. We really still don't even have election results now. At that point, it was just, do we record and face the decision of mentioning the election, but also trying to talk about something else, or do we talk about the election? And we just decided, let's just not record. Let's just wait another week and release one today.
We're still not going to talk about the election today.
Well, I was going to ask you, we could take 5 minutes if you wanted to get anything off your chest regarding current events. We could take 5 minutes so you could just say it and be done, and then we can move on.
The only thing I would really just remind people is, one, if they remember their history, they know that George H.W. Bush and Al Gore, I'm pretty sure it was those two running against each other. We didn't actually know election results until, I believe, December 12th. So, this is not the first time this situation has happened in history. That being said, I do think that this election is fundamentally going to change every election going forward. And the reason I say fundamentally is because I'm not talking just about like mail-in voting is going to become an even bigger thing because it already has existed, but now people know about it and are going to use it. I'm saying fundamentally, I believe the way that we function as a country with elections is going to change. I think it's too early to say whether it would be for the better or worse. But I think there's a lot of things that are fundamentally going to change about our country. And some of it will be a good thing because I think for a long time we've just kind of floated along. And there are some things that need reviewing, and it's always good, in my mind, to take a step back and look at where you've come from, where you are you actually where you want to be, and, and then other things I think are going to change even more for the worse. Again, this is all from my perspective and what I deem is right and wrong and where the world should be heading, and America's role in that, but I don't know, I just think we always tend to have blinders on and focus on the very present moment. I think that's been a big problem of the past few years and just the society at large. So I'm hoping that regardless of the outcome of this election, that it will encourage people, one, to have more open, honest conversations with people and actually bring back that free speech and dialogue that we champion in our First Amendment, as well as look critically at the way our country functions at all levels of government and legislature and consider where we may actually need to change things. Or if we don't, and figure out what's working.
Do you want to say anything about what you were telling me the other day between voting for policy versus a personality?
Sure. Obviously, it's a little late now for that to apply to this election. At least I believe so. I believe most states have stopped voting yesterday.
But isn't there still something with Georgia? Or did that already transpire?
I think now it's just a matter of reporting. They haven't counted all of the ballots. I believe yesterday, I think Pennsylvania was the last state to allow people to vote until the 12th, and that was yesterday. So we had a conversation, really fairly brief, about this whole idea of, do you vote? I mean, obviously there's been the whole conversation of voting for someone or against someone that's been going on this year because of the two very polar opposite people and parties we've had. But then there's also a conversation of voting for issues or policies. Those two are different, but I'm going to kind of lump them in a same way of voting versus voting for a personality. I think one of the things I've heard a lot this year that really irritated me was when people would watch the debates and say, that was really entertaining, or that was boring. Since when did politics come down to a game of entertainment? That's what Hollywood does. That's not what the White House is supposed to do.
Yeah, but you can argue it's the whole Neil Postman, the medium determines the message. Is that what he says?
Yes, and that's why I would say I understand how we got there. It doesn't make it right.
Exactly. No, that's not what my argument is. I'm just saying it's very clear when it switched from policies to personality, because once people got on the radio and then they got on TV, I think TV was the big stepping stone in turning it from actually listening to the content that someone was saying versus, now just judging them based on their outward appearance and how they carry themselves.
I mean, let's be honest. We make those kind of judgments all
exactly.
stinking day long. Like,
exactly.
We are always, whether or not, we can think we're the most accepting, welcoming, open-minded person, but you are fundamentally wired to be making judgments. And I'm going to use judgments.
Yeah,
with the understanding
judgment
of
calls, because that's
it's
how you
judgments,
survive.
it's decisions, it's really minute things that you're deciding whether or not you trust someone or if they're safe to be around or you need to be worried based on how they present themselves. And that clearly was a shift in how Americans considered and understood and what they believed about politics when you had the advent of the television and things like that. Even the radio wasn't that big of a thing. Sure, you could hear people's voices now, but it wasn't a huge ideological shift that you saw with the television. So I can understand why we've come to a point where people are now talking about debates as being entertaining or boring. But again, it's not right. And I think that it, in particular, is something that we could be more mindful and aware of and start changing of. We don't want entertainers in the White House. I don't know if anyone's thought about that. We don't want people who are just charming but have no substance and can't actually run a country. We want people who can be polite and respectful and can be good leaders, who sometimes are going to say things that you disagree with, but that's also part of being a leader, and then who actually can understand the politics. I guess on that note, like, playing the game of politics is very different than entertainment. And I feel like a lot of the times they've merged in politics. I'm kind of rambling at this point. So just to get back.
Well, I think your main point is just, and this is where my biggest frustration is, if 2020 has taught us anything, really if life has taught us anything, is you can't have a plan and expect to execute the plan to a T, and that there will be no bumps along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why during the debates, beyond the personal attacks that everyone was giving and the massive interruptions and the fact that it was not a debate, because there really was no substantive answers to anything. Is it substantive or substantive?
It's substantive.
My vocabulary early in the morning is apparently not great. But my biggest complaint was all of the questions had to do with something forward-looking. And I get to a certain extent, as the leader of a country, right, you do need to be a visionary and think strategically. But for the sake of a debate and when you're trying to determine who to elect, it's really a poor decision to try to do it based off what they promised to do for the country, because promises can be broken. We should all know this from personal experience. Promises can be broken. People are liars because we're all sinful, broken people. So really, when we're trying to elect someone, we should be looking off their track record. And with both of the political candidates that we had this year, we had Joe Biden, who has served in politics for years and decades. And then we had President Trump, who obviously has been in the White House for a time. So we did have track records to compare and actually break down, here's what you did on the economic side, here's what you did on the social side, here's how you handled international relations. We had evidence and data to compare. And I think that should have been where the focus was, on their policies and how they executed them, versus some sort of irrelevant plans about how they're going to stop COVID. When the reality, you can't stop a virus, people. You can plan to a T, and then you could die because you got COVID. Like, it's just not humanly possible to control things that are outside of our control, but that's what people want.
Well, and to your point, when you talk about track record, that's, I think, that's part of the whole of voting on issues and policies. The policies piece is vote off what they have done in terms of whether they've been in, like for Biden, been in the Senate, ? I'm pretty sure he was yeah. For Biden being in the Senate and his career, for Trump being in the White House, President Trump being in the White House, you have passed policies and things they've actually done. I don't want to say you completely ignore what their plans are for the future, because that is where I would say, like, the voting on issues is a little bit, it's tricky again, because you can't have a plan that's always 100% accurate in life in general, but especially in politics, because things do change and there's a lot of different factors. But that's what voting on a policy and issues would be. But then you've got the whole side of voting on a personality, and that's very much where you get into the us against them mentality and really aggressive and defensive of one candidate over another. And it's the whole entertainment thing. Like, you have to put on a show as a politician, and you have to put on a show that appeals to a large swath of people, but you also have to put on a show for your party too. It gets really confusing, and then people start, it's ride or die by one of them based on who they are, and
which you can't to a certain extent control the reaction of the people either. That shouldn't be your goal.
No,
but it's frustrating.
Unfortunately, I think nowadays, because like we said in our current events, when people have so much faith in government, I think we've given politicians so much power to control how we think.
Which is why you have massive overreactions, because when you look to politics as your god, when your god isn't in power, of course you're going to be upset.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that's kind of our conversation of vote for the policies, vote for issues. Sometimes that's going to line up with the particular person just naturally, as far as you know, but as long as you vote for those things, one, I think it'll make you a better understand where you, like, it'll require you to do the research and understand your own positions on those things, which
we can all do a little bit more. No, we can all benefit from a little bit more self-knowledge. That's what I was going to say.
Yes. Versus going with the now normal way of voting, which is voting based on a person or a party without truly understanding what they stand for and what they say they're going to do.
Any mindless activity you should probably stop and consider.
I should probably fix that.
Yeah. Mindlessness is not a good way to live your life or make decisions. The one last thing that I was going to say was, one, obviously it's probably more important. Definitely more important to be involved in your local government than the federal government. Obviously, I would totally believe that we have a responsibility to vote and be involved in every level of government. But where you are going to see the most impact personally is in your local community. So be involved there. And on that note, too, I think to go back to what you were saying, Grace, with your first point, is this idea of vision casting or thinking strategically about the future and not thinking so much about the present and what you want from the current administration. You need to think more about, where do you want America to be 5 years, 10 years down the road? What do you want for your children? What do you want for your spouse? What is your vision for America? And how do you communicate that to a mission, and how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it, the people involved, the principles involved, policies involved, and think strategically about how you can achieve that vision. Obviously understanding, right, that you are one person. You cannot bring a whole entire nation behind you. Even a president can't do that unless they just flex their authority muscles and strong arm everyone to get there. But even then, that's not how America was set to work. People have to weigh in and buy into things. But as an individual citizen, I would just encourage you, be involved in politics. Just don't be discouraged. Still be hopeful, because you do have a voice right now, so use your voice and work towards a specific vision of what you want the country, and find people to also hold that same vision and work towards it together, because that's what America was set up to work as. But enough of the political talking, though actually it does provide a good segue into our actual conversation, because
it does. It functions as a backdrop. I think there's a lot of different things that I think we can talk about as we get more into our subject
because
today.
You have both political candidates, you have just general society, and the idea of safe spaces and all of that.
Social media.
Yes. But so today's topic is politeness versus frankness. And I'll give a quick backstory about this topic, because I was the one who came up with it. I follow a YouTube channel called The School of Life, and they post some really interesting videos about a variety of topics. And I came across one. It's probably a year or two old, actually, at this point.
It's actually from 2016.
Okay, yeah, so it's fairly old. I wonder if it came out around...
Just because it's old does not mean it's no longer relevant.
No, that's not what I was going to say.
I'm just clarifying.
I think it's even more
people.
relevant. I wonder if it came out around the 2016 elections, though. I just realized.
I believe it came out in October.
Okay, so actually...
of 2016.
Who knows? Maybe it did, because...
So it would have been coming out during the debates of that year.
Yeah.
The presidential
debates. Interesting. I just made that connection. Anyway, so the video is all about politeness versus frankness and the ideologies behind those two social norms and what those people believe and how it impacts a society. And that, at the end of the video, their argument is that politeness is something that Americans need to relearn because we've been so focused on the frankness for the past 2 centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, if we take in context the 2016 election season, in which maybe this video had something to do with, it was obvious that at that point American society had just taken to personal attacks, right, and being very aggressive. And well, I don't know if you can say that about the populace as a whole, but it was evident in our political parties at that point in time that the polarization was there, the personal attacks were there. There was no such thing as civil dialogue going on.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of the idea of the video is with any sort of ideology, right? You have to take it to what is it going to produce in society in 10 years. 10 years is an arbitrary number, but what impact is it actually going to have? And I think that's what the video does with politeness versus frankness. It does with frankness a little bit more than politeness. But the idea is, if you have these two social norms, what kind of fruit does it have in society, and which fruit would we rather have?
Exactly. It's what kind of fruit does it provide you as an individual, but then, to your point, yes, it's society at large, it's your posterity, and how your children are going to, what world they're going to grow up in. And I find it really interesting that, when people say polite or frank, which, frank honesty, I don't know if I would actually say frankness is honesty. What's another way of...
It's directness.
Yeah.
It's speaking... I think frank people believe that what they're speaking is honesty, but frankness is just not being afraid to say what you're thinking. Yes. Being very direct and straightforward. So that way of functioning and worldview is very much actually in contrast with the understanding of a polite person. And I found that really interesting because when people use those words nowadays, I don't think people understand all of the connotations and history of these words and what they're actually tied to. So how about you give our listeners a brief description of both of them, of politeness and frankness?
All right. Put me on the spot, why don't you? So, to my understanding, the polite person is someone who functions on the understanding that they are inherently sinful inherently sinful. And so a lot of those thoughts that they would potentially be saying if they were frank, a lot of those urges and desires they would be acting upon, they actually end up suppressing because it would just be in an attempt to hurt someone, to lie to someone, to do something sinful and mean and not good. So that's a lot of where you see some of the let's think before we speak kind of actions playing out. They also believe that other people are different than them. So while we're all still human, they don't naturally assume that you just will agree with them. Or, if they're hot, you're hot too. Or if they like spicy food, you must like spicy food. And they're generally ask a lot of questions about how you're feeling to test the ground and just bridge that gap that they perceive between humans. Obviously fill in if I'm missing anything. Another thing that was mentioned was this idea of vulnerability. So a polite person will often come from the position that other people are wrestling with self-doubt and uncertainty, and whether that's an internal thing of them struggling to figure out where they fit in the world and who they are versus kind of an external thing of they're going through something, they're suffering, but you can't see it until you ask questions and they're hesitant to open up, right? It's this idea of you could say something to someone and just speak freely, but they may not be in the same position or in a position to receive it in the way that you would hope they would. And so you can actually end up doing damage to that person or that friendship based on what you say because you were just being frank instead of politely inquiring, where are you at right now? And learning from them before you share your thoughts on something. I think that's kind of what they said about politeness. Did I miss anything on that?
No, to summarize, I think it's just politeness. The core belief is natural sin? What am I?
Original sin.
Thank you. I'm like, what is the biblical doctrine? Original sin. It's a belief in original sin. And so polite people disclaimer, obviously these are massive generalizations, which is something the video does point out, but polite people tend to be ones who are very aware of their darker desires and darker intentions behind things, and so they tend to be a lot more sensitive about how those play out, and also other people's needs and desires too. I think you said it pretty well in how you described it.
Okay. And then the frank person, you could potentially say, is almost a polar opposite. I don't know if I would go that far, but they do have some fundamental differences. So one being that they believe in the original goodness of people. And so from their perspective, it's no matter what they say or think or do, it's just inherently good, or ultimately will be good, because they function on a belief that everybody should be frank and direct. That's just how the world should function. And it doesn't matter what you say, it's generally good, and people are good. Unlike the polite person who sees this gap, the frank person thinks that people are basically like them. Not identical to them, but they think, everybody else is going to be frank. If I like spicy food, well, you must like this spicy food. Or if I like this music, you must like it. Now, I want to turn it all the way up to, blaring it. Well, you should be fine with that too.
I don't know if it's they necessarily think that, or it's just more of they're just not as aware of asking for other people what their opinions are.
I guess, yeah. I guess it would be on an assumption that they don't ask because they assume that since you function like they do, you would just tell them, right? Like, it's a mutual frankness that they expect from other
like
people.
If you have a difference of opinion, you would be frank and just say, hey, I don't like spicy food, or I don't actually like that music. Can we
so they don't function, which I guess goes to the second part of they think that people are inherently robust is the word the video used, but I guess it would be better characterized as people will like stick up for themselves kind of thing. If they're not easily offended by something, they'll say what's on their mind too. They'll like return your frankness, if that makes sense. Of they're not going to be vulnerable, and so it wouldn't necessarily impact like how their emotions and a private side that they share with you, although I think sometimes it does, but we can get into that later. But it's a belief that people are not struggling with self-doubt. Their ego's not it's -0. Ego meaning not ego obviously can mean pride, and I do think that happens, but it's also just a sense of self.
Yeah, self-confidence and
knowing that
your value.
Yes, that is, at a normal level, and they're fine, and they're not questioning themselves. They're not going to be super sensitive to something you say and super offended. And so it really is this idea of since you are a frank person and believe in the original goodness and that people should be frank, you just expect people to return that to you. So there's a lot of you don't ask questions as frequently because you just expect people to tell you things like you tell them. Did I miss anything with that?
In some ways, I think politeness versus frankness. Politeness tends to focus a lot more on the how do we almost redirect or even cover our natural bent towards sinfulness. Whereas frankness tends to focus more on black and white and right and wrong. And there's an unspoken expectation that if you are in the wrong, someone will point it out, or if you're right, everyone will just go along with it because everyone knows it's right.
Yeah, I guess to that point, it's politeness sees the inherent. They recognize there's good and evil in the world, and people are originally sinful and naturally sinful, but there's also a whole layer of complexity, and so you see them being a lot more tentative with speaking and asking questions and just trying to navigate the waters of nuance that they find themselves in, whereas the frank person, they also function on a level of there is right and wrong, and they can see it, but it is a lot more black and white, to your point, and they expect that other people can also see that difference too.
Yes. So I want to I think the next step is, I assume our listeners probably already know which one each of us gravitates to, but let's just spell it out and say the obvious. I tend to be
more polite.
Yes. How did you know what I was going to say?
I just know how
I am
think.
the most polite person on the face of the planet.
Exactly.
I should be like Queen Elizabeth.
Oh my word.
I don't even know. No, I tend to be a much more frank person, and even when I'm not super frank, I do have to say, I will admit, I pride myself on being someone who just speaks straightforwardly on things, and I actually don't like myself a lot when I don't do that, and I feel a hesitancy to just say things because from my personal experience, I see there's a lot of value in if you feel or think something. For me, it's mostly thinking something. You should just say it, and it tends to disseminate a lot of hard feelings or things that could come up later. You know, in relationships specifically, if things aren't just said, then there's a lot of things underneath the surface that can cause a lot of issues and a lot of toxicity later on in that relationship.
Before I say who I am, although people probably know who I am or which one I gravitate towards more,
it starts with a P.
Yes.
You have two options. Okay. Polite or polite.
Oh my gosh. Well, yes. Okay. So
or all of the above.
All of the above. No.
Everything.
All right. So fine. We'll just, yes. I gravitate more towards what the polite person would act like and what they would think. Obviously, I just want to clarify right now. I think we'll talk about it more towards the end as we kind of wrap up our conversation. But I do just want to tell people, I don't want to set politeness and frankness as polar opposites.
Shh. No. I know where your brain is going, and don't talk about this yet.
Okay.
Because I think I want to kind of follow the structure of the video in a way, in that they gave definitions, they talked about the ideologies.
Here's me already trying to be polite and
this is great.
Frustrate people.
I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to offend. If you're frank, I still love you. If you're polite, I still love you. Happy. What the heck? Happy. Harmony.
Happy hop.
Oh my gosh. Neither of us can talk this early in the morning. Apparently,
oh my
we need to
gosh.
stop recording at like 6 a.m.
I mean, our sister did just send me a picture of a rabbit last night who was thinking adorable, so I maybe have an excuse for having like
stuck in the doorbell.
No, she had a rabbit picture that she sent me last night. And he was so cute, and so I have an excuse for potentially having hippity hop hop. Somewhere in my brain, because I did see a rabbit last night.
For some reason, I thought you said doorbell in that original sentence.
Apparently, she can't listen this early in the morning. It's debatable whether or not she can listen anytime.
Stuck in a doorbell. I don't know how I feel about that. Poor rabbit. I guess.
Just offended you.
But why? You did not offend me.
I know, she wasn't even listening.
You can't offend me. If there are two things people should know about me, it's one, I don't get embarrassed easily, and two, I also don't get offended easily because of the fact I don't get embarrassed easily.
True.
Anyway.
True. All right, so I'll reserve my point until we
what I was saying
kind of
is
follow the...
give definitions, talk about the ideologies, differences, and then the video starts to provide a bit of what they propose as a solution at the end, and I think that's the structure we should follow.
Disagrees with it.
And
strongly.
Yeah. But I'm telling you, Grace, my way is the right way. You're going to disagree with me? No, because you're polite.
Oh my gosh. No, I'm not going to disagree with you. I think that outline of conversation...
What I really want to talk about now is... as someone who is more frank and you being more polite, I want to talk about the differences that we see in each of them. So I want to talk about politeness and what I see are some of the strengths and weaknesses. And then how about you talk about frankness and what you think are some of the strengths and weaknesses. And we can both respond to each other and say, yes, I agree with that. Or as someone who, I hate using this phrase, but as someone who identifies as a polite person.
Yeah.
I hate that phrase. Oh, heebie-jeebies. Which no one uses that phrase
I would say as someone who has the behaviors more of a frank person. Let's say that, because I do want to... I want to stray away from, like, I am polite.
Yeah, don't identify...
Because people, right we grow and we change.
Yeah, you inherently... No, that's not the phrase either. I don't know. Come up with something. Give me something.
Just say that your behaviors and... how you function,
or you hold to the social norm of politeness.
Yes, there you go.
We'll just do that. Okay,
and you hold to the social norm of frankness.
Okay, so politeness. Which one should I go with? Positives or negatives?
Whichever one. I don't care.
Oh, sheesh. Okay. So obviously, taking you as my example of politeness, I think let's go with the strengths first, which is...
I was just going to say I actually do care. Let's start with the positives.
let's start with the positive. Okay, let's throat Grace Seagal. And then we'll throw knives at her.
Oh, my word. It's not just...
sedate her and then murder her. So, positives of politeness. One, I definitely think that You can have a lot more emotional intelligence as a polite person because you really have to work on understanding yourself, both your weaknesses and your strengths, and then trying to express those in a way that acknowledges other people's emotions about things. So I think the word is overused and I hate it, but I think as a polite person, you can have a tendency to be more empathetic. Because you're genuinely trying to seek to understand another person's experience in a situation and what it is that they believe and what it is that they feel and the thoughts that it invokes in them and all of those types of things. You have a antenna up kind of for sensitivity is how I think I imagine it, where you're like
the finger in the air, like
seeing
which way the wind's blowing.
Which way does the wind go? That's kind of how you are with reading other people. You can be very observant of a room, and so you tend to, it's not even just thinking before you speak, but it's observing before you speak, really processing before you speak, because you want to make sure that as much as possible you've covered all the bases before you open your mouth. And it's not necessarily a fear of offending people or what is the word? Estrangement?
Yeah.
All of these words that I want to say.
Causing dissension.
Yeah, well, I guess I was saying more of estraining yourself from people, but that's not how you use that word.
I don't know if you can actually use it like that.
Distancing yourself from people, cutting off a relationship.
Yes.
I need to work on my vocabulary. But...
Girl, it's like 6:45 in the morning.
I understand. I realize, you can tell I'm such a homeschool reader because I have all of these words, and then I start using them and realize, one, I don't know how to pronounce them. Two, I don't actually know all of their dictionary forms in order to use them. But anyway, it's not necessarily from a place of fear, as I was saying. It's from a place of genuine interest in other people. Really wanting to, I think part of it is wanting to make yourself a better person too, because of the fact that you are constantly going against your natural instincts to do what feels right for yourself. It's self-motivated, and you're constantly working against that to think of, it's not necessarily universalism, not universalism. No, utilitarian perspective of the greater
good. What's
good.
better for that other person in that circumstance.
But you're really focused on the relationships and understanding that you can't survive as an individual, that you have to form relationships and you have to be in a community, and learning how to get along with other people is a key part of that. So I think that's emotional intelligence, empathy, sensitivity, observation. Those are strengths of being a polite person. I think also you being more of a rule follower is obviously another, it can be a strength too, because
I think obviously some of these, as we get into the negatives, you'll see there's a positive side.
Well, it's the whole
and
idea of the greatest
side.
strength is also the greatest weakness, right? And so I think societies have to run off generalities. That's how rules are formed. I mean, obviously they should have a moral foundation.
If you didn't know, like, norms is the normal way. It's the expected way.
But it's not to say it applies to every situation. And that's what I mean by societies have to run off generalities. In what does most of the population need in the legislation? So let's take, for instance, First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion. There are going to be people who disagree with that. There are going to be people who think it's irrelevant because they don't have a religion. But that in and of itself is a freedom of religion to either believe or not believe. So something like that, that's not really a great example because it's more of a right versus a law, I guess.
Well, it's an example of a societal norm in that in America, we have believed for the longest time that it is an inherent and alienable right of people to be able to speak their mind and share their opinions on something and argue about it, or to not do so, as well as to believe in a religion and worship in that way, or not.
Yeah. And I guess it is a good example, because if you think about very bloody regimes and stuff.
I was going to say, whereas some place like, I don't know, we'll pick an obvious example of North Korea, since I think most people would agree it's fundamentally different than the United States. There, it's not believed that people have the fundamental right to free speech and freedom of religion.
Not that we're saying that they're frank or polite. I don't necessarily think
no,
that makes sense
I'm just saying...
But it's just more the idea, right, that as
an
a polite
example
person...
of a social norm,
you're looking
America functions very differently with a social norm regarding religion and speech for its history than North Korea does.
Yeah, and I think it's the polite person obviously has a tendency to look more outwardly and towards other people, and that's why they tend to be more rule followers and understanding what's best for the most amount of people.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think it also has to go to a more inherent respect of people in authority and leadership positions as well. Again, you may not... Well, I'll just leave it at that. You can talk about that more if you want to. I just thought I'd throw that out there, and just it's not any rule that we'll follow, but I think as a polite person, because you ask questions and you're trying to understand where another person comes from, you are inherently more comfortable with the authority and leadership placed above you for the most part. There may be like an investigative phase to figure out a lot of things, but you don't have that staunch, I want to do it my way kind of flag in the ground.
Well, because you're a lot more open to receiving different opinions and beliefs from the people around you that I think you maybe lean towards on the authority and respect side. I think you maybe lean towards more of those people didn't get there because they were bad people. They got to their positions of authority because they were looking out for those around them, or, you know, they were abiding by some of your beliefs as a polite person.
And I guess it also kind of stems from, you know, original sin, and you realize that you have to try and suppress some of your natural tendencies, but if someone's in authority over you and they've gotten there because they've earned that position, then there's like now another person. Authority is there to help you, not to harm you.
Which is also the point I was going to make next, which is, as a polite person, you also have the tendency to be more submissive, which is a good thing. Especially as women, Scripture calls us to be submissive specifically to our husbands when we get married. And I think as a polite person, you do have that tendency to be more accepting of being submissive to an authority figure in your life. And that doesn't mean that you're a doormat, obviously.
Doesn't mean we're perfect all the time.
Yeah, because like you've been saying with a polite person, and you want to seek to understand that person's perspective. So it doesn't mean that as someone who's going to submit to an authority, you're not trying to understand where that authority figure stands and why they made the decisions that they made, or what their plan is for the future. It's not that you're just going with the flow. It's just at the end of the day, you understand they have the authority, they have the final say, and you're going to go with it because to a certain extent you don't want to
rock the boat.
Yeah, rock the boat was good. I was going to say something about the waters, but I couldn't remember what the phrase is.
It's rock the boat, I think, is what you're looking for.
Yeah, let's do that.
I would just say, I wouldn't even necessarily categorize the person who goes with the flow all the time as a polite person. I think that's a fundamentally different worldview than a polite person. Just to clarify, I do think there are, when you get to the negatives, there are a lot of things that can head that direction and some other directions with the polite person. But we're talking about a person who's like in the average range of being polite.
Yeah. So, speaking of the weaknesses, and these weaknesses are more of, like we were saying earlier, if you take the ideology of politeness to its natural conclusion, I think that's where you find most of the weaknesses, is if someone lives as a polite person for a very extended period of time and they start not being super intentional about why they're polite.
It's easy to get lazy.
It's easy to get lazy, or it's very easy. Well, there's two paths, I think, which is one is easy to get lazy and almost just take the easiest polite response to something and do nothing else and just go on with your life, right? Where it's, you're not rocking the boat, but you're also not really forming relationships. You're just kind of navigating through society. And no one's angry at you because you're a nice person, but beyond being nice, there's really no substance to you, and you're just super apathetic. So I think that's one path. I think the most harmful path, though, is when you are so adept at politeness, there comes a certain level of artificiality and manipulation that you can have, right? Where now it just becomes behavior and habits, polite behavior and habits, but you're using all of those in such a way for your own gain, and because you know that you can get, to a certain extent, you know that you can get this response from this person based off of the behavior that you have, right? You can start leading them down a different path or playing mind games with them and stuff. And it's not, that's, I think, one of the biggest arguments against politeness is that it has a tendency towards artificiality and just disingenuousness at the end of the day, because it's more built around social rules versus self-expression. Yeah, and this is where you were saying earlier, sorry, I want to finish this thought before you interrupt, but about the polite person and vulnerability, and that they have this desire to kind of cover themselves up with politeness and not be open with people and not be frank. I think that leads towards wearing a mask in public spaces and with other people, and that no one actually really understands who you are, and you build up a wall and people can't get to know you, and it just becomes a routine of 2 + 2 = 5 versus this is grace.
Yeah. I think, yes.
There's a bit of a people-pleasing perfectionism that I think goes along with politeness.
So I'd say there's 3 main, potentially 4 paths that someone who's polite, according to this strict definition that we've given it, could follow and end up at. And it would be, 1, it would be the person who's just becomes lazy and goes with the flow and doesn't care anymore. It can be the doormat, like you mentioned, of someone who's so concerned with offending other people and not doing that and not getting into conflict, and who just respects authority, and it's easier at that point to just let people decide. So in some sense, the doormat is tied to the go with the flow, except that I think the doormat is different in that they still actually get internally angry about things, but they're just not going to do something about it. So they just submit to anything, and it's much easier. Then there's the third one, which you just mentioned, of actually becoming fake and kind of manipulative in how you use politeness, and it very much is a mask now of who you truly are, and it's no longer real politeness, but it's just become a big piece of your way of functioning in the world and kind of playing the game now. I think a 4th one would be what you just mentioned, which is a crippling people-pleasing. It's a little different than the doormat, although I think they share some things, but I think a doormat is a little bit more external thing, in that people can see that in you and they realize, oh, hey, I can walk all over you. Whereas the perfectionist, people-pleasing kind of mindset is more of an internal hindrance, and you start doubting yourself so much to the point that, you know, you're always questioning whether you asked the right question or did the right thing or said the polite thing, or, oh my gosh, you screwed it up because this person's now mad at you, kind of thing. So I think those are kind of the 4, as we've defined politeness based on this video, those are kind of the 4 pitfalls I can see that can happen to, you know, there can be a couple at a time, and I think you're always struggling with them to a certain extent. But if you were to follow it to its natural conclusion based on a lot of different factors, you could end up in those 4 buckets, I think.
Yeah, that's a good summary. So, now that we've talked about politeness, do you want to go over to frankness and you talk about strengths and weaknesses there?
Yes. So I think some of the benefits and advantages of being a frank person are that you are open with people, and nobody's having to sit back and be like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? I don't know where we are right now, kind of thing. You are very forthright in that information, and that I think it helps I think it can help in general of just getting to know someone, or especially if there's an issue. I think that's where frankness can really shine a lot of the times, is if there's an issue, you generally will address it right now instead of letting it become a problem down the road. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Again, there's a lot of things that I think we're going to talk about towards the end of it, and just how those two play out. But in general, I think it would be safe to say that a frank person will handle conflict in relationships and at large better than a polite person in the short term. I think a frank person you also ask questions and want to learn things, but it's different than a polite person in that again, like for you, it's you're just curious about things because you're curious about them versus you're trying to understand how other people function in the world. So it's different, but I still think it's a benefit of a frank person is, you know, their thoughts aren't always insubstantive thoughts. They actually have some good things to say, and it's because they are still intelligent human beings and emotional human beings. I think it's interesting that you pointed out when you said you had more of characteristics of a frank person, that you said you tend to share a lot of what you think, and then you clarified and said not what you feel. I think that has to go back to how you're wired.
Yeah.
But I do believe that frank people, there are some frank people who just share what they're feeling, and there are some frank people who just share what they're thinking. Here's where I'm kind of going to go. It's a negative and positive both at the same time. I think sharing what your thoughts are and opinions about something is generally depending on how you position it, because again, there's a lot of phrases that can make you, let's be honest, frank people can either come across as obnoxious, stuck-up people, or jerks. They can come as jerks, or they can come across as just open, honest, transparent people. And I hate the word, but it kind of falls in the authenticity, that whole conversation. Yeah. I hate the word, so we're going to stick with frankness. But it can kind of be, they just come across as genuine people who are sure of themselves and want to learn, but aren't crippled by any sort of self-doubt kind of thing. Yeah. And if they are, they're just honest. And it can be really refreshing, especially in the time we live nowadays. Whereas I think the person who just focuses on sharing a lot of emotions, it becomes just a waterfall, and it's really tiring. And I think that's what some frank people can, if you're always sharing things, that can be a weakness of sometimes it isn't something you've thought through, and you're just saying it, and it does offend people, and it does lead to conflict, and it's not really the best thing. Or you're just like raging in anger, and it's nope. You didn't decide, you didn't figure out if that was actually the right time and place and people to be venting to like that.
I think the point here is the difference between politeness and frankness is that frank people tend to just say what they think and feel. Polite people tend to think that they can't do that or believe that they can't do that, which obviously leads to, as a frank person, you can overshare. As a polite person, you undershare. And there are good and bad things. I mean, feelings... Yeah, if someone loves you, you want them to just come out and say, hey, I love you, because no one wants to wait and dance around their feelings for another person, like in that context. So that's a good example of someone just being frank about their emotions. Just as someone, you know, as Christians specifically, we're called to give an answer for what we believe. And so that's another example of, as a frank person, if you just say, hey, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, you're not going to change my mind. That's a good example of just being honest about your thoughts.
And I think on that note, you know, some of the other benefits of someone who's just frank is when it comes to authority and leadership, the questions they ask and how they respond to it. Again, it can be a negative and a positive. On the positive side, I think it's you will disagree with someone about something and make it known, and then like initiate that kind of conversation, which is really helpful. You'll have the conflict that needs to be had and you'll work through it, but you'll also affirm the person. And just, if you agree with what the policy is, you'll follow it, and if they know you, it's kind of you may not have to say anything, and they'll probably appreciate it. I think on principle, a lot of frank people will disagree with something, but that's not always bad. And I think as a frank person in a conversation, you can bring a lot of needed open dialogue to something, whether it's about a policy or about politics or something like that. It's a breath of fresh air into a conversation. And then just in general, because frank people don't get easily offended, it makes having the conversations that frank people naturally have both easy to participate in and to observe. Because for the most part, it could hurt. I'm not going to say that it would never offend them and they would never get hurt and they would never be scarred by something. That could happen. But for the most part, I think they function off a quick to forgive and forget kind of basis of anything that's said in an argument or conversation. They'll work through it right then, and then they can move on. Again, not that they don't ever have trauma. They will most definitely have events in their life that are horrific, and things they'll remember, but but in a normal conversation, it's refreshing to see that kind of dialogue can happen. And that's what I appreciate about a frank person. I've already mentioned some of the negatives that can happen, and this is where I think frankness and authenticity can kind of collide, and it's really frustrating of just sometimes, like you mentioned, you can overshare. Frankness can also become a facade, and if people know you as a frank person, it kind of just becomes you're always expected to share what you think, and you're always expected to be real and genuine and honest, and it's like, sometimes you don't want to do that because there is something you're struggling with, but because you function on a different worldview in which, and I'm struggling how to figure out how to say it, but it's because you are known to share those things,
mm-hmm.
it becomes almost an internal battle with yourself, I think, of not sharing those, but then still sharing pieces. I don't know. Obviously, I'm not a frank person in that regard, so I'm just saying from externals, I've seen bits and pieces of how people can war with themselves of all of a sudden they realize they're experiencing something that they don't want to share about
mm-hmm.
in the moment. And it is an internal conflict that I see. And I don't know. I guess I'm putting it in the negative because it's a difficult thing that you have to work through.
Yeah, because when your guiding principle is to share things, then you feel kind of guilty if you
And I think you just mentioned
don't
it
share
of
things.
Yeah, like you have thoughts in your head of you get mad at yourself if you're not forthright with someone. And it's interesting to me because I think polite people can also get mad at themselves, but it's for completely different reasons.
Yeah.
And so it's excuse me. So I think there's a whole internal world of a frank person that, even though they function off this belief that they're basically good, that people are robust and they're not super offended by things, it doesn't negate the fact that you do still have emotions as a human being. You do still doubt yourself at times. And so I think presenting this like strong, independent, confident, says what they think, says what they feel, can attack conflict head on kind of person can in the end be really exhausting and can lead to a lot of problems with relationships because you're not always asking questions about other people. You're not always trying to figure out where they are. And so even though you may be saying everything you think about something, they could not trust you. And so down the road, it may work in the short term, but down the road, I can definitely see a frank person burning a lot of bridges. And
alienating themselves.
Yeah, alienating themselves from people and from experiences because of how they function. Because they don't necessarily embrace the nuances of life. And that can be really abrasive. So, I think that kind of summarizes a lot of the negatives of a frank person. And living that way.
Yeah. Well, it's actually perfect for the thought that I had of when you were giving the descriptions of politeness and frankness, one of the things that you said, which I know this is from the video too, so it wasn't necessarily exactly what you believe, but one of the points made is that a frank person tends to have more of an ego or self-confidence and assumes that everyone around them does. I would hesitate to say that I actually have that. In the sense of I definitely project this idea of someone who is a lot more confident and sure of herself, but I think deep down personally I have a lot of insecurity and doubts about my own worth. So I'm curious for you and for me too. I wonder how politeness and frankness actually turn into coping mechanisms or ways for us to project a different image of ourselves to the world, because I think that's a whole other aspect that plays into these two behavior methods, is whether or not you do believe that you can be yourself or that you have to cover up, because I think frankness and politeness can both come from that belief of having to be something that you're not, right? Because you could be a frank person solely because even though deep down you are more of a person who wants to understand people and is more emotionally driven and observant and relationship focused, you could be someone who is frank because of the fact that you see a lot of danger in emotions and relationships, and you kind of want to shut that down by being frank. Whereas I could be polite because if have a lot of disagreement, but I have insecurity about disagreeing with people
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to be right, but believing that no one will ever hear my voice or something, then maybe I just outwardly start just being polite and going with the flow, because I think if I disagree now, well, then later I can just do my own thing and fix it, and it's not worth the conflict.
Yeah. I may be getting ahead of myself in this conversation. To your point, we talked about how, particularly in this video, like, politeness and frankness are set out to have very different ideologies behind them and worldviews behind them. I think that the idea of original sin as a Christian should be the foundation for everything. And since it actually is, both politeness and frankness break down at some point, because we are sinful and we can't do anything perfectly. And to your point, yes, politeness and frankness both become cover-ups for things that we dislike about ourselves and that we don't want other people to know, or just coping mechanisms when we're struggling with something. And that's why I mentioned, I think it's important to realize that a frank person still has the internal battles with themselves that a polite person does. It's just maybe the conclusion is a little different because of the facade they've put up and because of who they are, because of how they have so long functioned in the world. And this is why I wanted to steer away from the identifying as a polite person, because to a certain extent, I do think it's right to say you are a polite person. But it's truly that it goes to how you function in the world. And if you grow up as being told that the polite way of acting is the right one, then it becomes so ingrained in you that that way of functioning in the world is the right way. And so you just do that even if you would naturally have been a more frank person. The same with the frank person. So it goes to the internal personality, but then, it's the whole conversation, nature versus nurture kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's both. You can be naturally, I just said that really oddly. You can be you can be naturally a frank person, but if you grow up in an environment and are nurtured to be a more polite person, it plays itself out differently. If you're a polite person, but you grow up in a very open and forthright household, you can just naturally adopt some of those tendencies and ways of functioning in the world and acting as a frank person. And all of it has its pitfalls and downfalls. And so I'm probably jumping the gun to the conclusion of what we actually think about these, so I'm just going to stop talking.
Well, I don't think you've gotten that far yet. And actually, I'm tending to think that we should maybe hold that for our next podcast episode. Well, because of the fact that there's a solution, but I think there's a biblical element to it that we will have a lot of conversation around.
That's fine.
I had some scriptures pulled up. I didn't know if we would get to them in this episode.
We've probably already talked for a very long time.
Yes, we have, which is why I'm saying let's focus this episode on the ideologies and the positives and negatives and our personal experience. And then our next episode, part 2, we can talk about the biblical perspective on these issues.
Okay, sounds good. So everyone, you're going to tune in next week to hear the actual...
Not next week. There will be no episode next week.
Right.
2 weeks from now.
Ignore me.
Because we will have an episode 2 weeks from now. We will actually probably in the meantime...
The 20th.
Have a Thanksgiving bonus episode.
No, the 20th is next week. I am all over the place.
Oh, so 2 weeks from now will be Thanksgiving.
It'll be the 27th. Okay. So right after Thanksgiving. So actually, people, sorry.
At some point, we will have a Thanksgiving bonus episode probably, and we might publish the full episode, part 2 of Polite and Frankness.
Yes. We'll let you know on Instagram, so follow us there if you don't already at time to talk.
We're not ending the episode yet.
I'm not. I'm just telling them, follow us there because we'll probably announce if we're posting a bonus episode on the Thursday of Thanksgiving or the Friday afterwards.
We're all kind of confused here.
Yeah, we'll just let you know when the bonus episode is going to be live and when the actual full episode conclusion of this conversation will be live.
Keep you guys on your toes.
Oh my gosh.
We're unpredictable over here. What? No, okay.
We're just following the pattern of 2020.
Oh my gosh. Who knows? It's going to be this, going to be that. We don't know. We don't have a plan.
Psych! It's both.
And wear masks. Even though they do nothing. Anyway. Superheroes. All right. So what was I going to say?
I don't know. I interrupted you.
So what I think originally, if I remember what I was saying, talking about personal, yes, because you were saying nature versus nurture, and I entirely agree with that perspective, because like we said, these are a lot of behavioral traits versus your personality. So what I was going to say is, on the personality side and how you're wired, it definitely makes more sense between the two of us that you are more of a polite person, I'm more of a frank one. If you take something like the MBTI personality assessment, you are an F and I'm a T. So you're going to be more relationship driven, hence the more polite person. I'm going to be more of the judge. I'm more of the thinker, processor, judger person, and so I'm going to just tend to be a lot more curious and frank about things, which to a certain extent, when we were talking about how these become coping mechanisms, is coping mechanisms the right phrase, or protection methods, or what's the word?
I guess
self-protection.
Well, I think coping mechanisms fit with as long as people understand we're not talking about
unhealthy. They're more unhealthy coping mechanisms to a certain extent.
We're not talking about like something of stress eating or like sleeping. Those are coping mechanisms, but those often come during times of particular struggle, whether it's emotional duress, mental duress, physical duress, and there's specific circumstances in which those kind of coping mechanisms happen. I think when we say coping mechanisms for being frank or polite, we're talking about you live in a world that is full of evil and people do evil things to you, and it's a way of coping with that reality.
Yeah.
And
it's like survival.
With that.
Yeah, it's survival modes versus coping mechanisms. It's because it's more based on you believe that you have to act this way in order to survive in the world.
Yes.
As an individual in a greater society.
So coping mechanisms work for that, but that's what survival we're defining modes, them. I don't know.
Okay, anyway. What I was gonna say is, what was I gonna say? I just lost my train of thought.
Something about it makes sense that because of our personalities, we have these different coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Well, okay, no, yes, because what I was going to say is, when I was mentioning earlier about that they can both be used as cover-ups for our actual feelings or thoughts about something, where I think to a certain extent, being a person who is frank, people believe that you're just going to say things, which almost then means that when you don't say something, people just don't assume you have anything to say, right? So if I make myself really outspoken on some sort of issue or some certain topic, and I am there's a level of manipulation to both frankness and politeness of, if I choose the things that I'm going to speak a lot about and have a lot of opinions, people expect me to say things about those. But if I don't say anything that is more of a personal, emotional frankness, people just don't expect me to say anything, right? Because I've set that baseline of, if I have something to say, I'm going to say it.
Yep.
Which then leads me into this quote-unquote safety, that people aren't going to ask me about personal and emotional things because I don't talk about those kind of things. But it's also...
It's a weird race where... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is there's safety in that, but then it's also the whole prison that you've now created for yourself of what happens when I do want to talk about these things, or I feel as if I need to talk about these things because I can't keep them in any longer.
Cue everyone turning and looking at you like you're an alien.
Right. Because you've set that foundation, and for me, it's very, very hard to, once you give people an image of yourself, it's extremely difficult to give them a different image.
It's not only
without them
battle you have to have with yourself, but now it's a understanding of who you are that you have to change in other people.
Yes.
Right? It's not just you have the war with yourself of, do I say it? Do we not say it? How do we do this? How are people going to respond? And then you have that next step of, now when you actually say something, you have to decide who you're going to say it to, because you now have to convince them that you're not an alien and that these are real things that you're feeling, like, if that makes sense.
And I've personally had experiences where, because I'm frank, I've had situations in which someone overshared something, and then I felt compelled to respond in like manner, and share something which just didn't end up being a great situation overall, because I gave away personal information that I didn't want to give away. And then I've had situations in which I want to share something with this person because I I trust them, and I do believe that they would respond well. But I feel as if I can't, because it would show some of the insecurity that I feel, which is complete opposite of the self-confidence that I portray on a normal manner. And I wonder, what's your experience as a polite person? Because I've observed things about you that I could say things. I'm curious to know what your experience has been as someone who is more polite. But do you also find that you kind of build up a prison for yourself? Or I don't know if prison is the right word, but you set up this expectation for other people about how you're going to behave, and then you feel like you can't break that.
Absolutely. There's multiple prisons I think I've built for myself of of just who I am and how I'm supposed to act, and one of those definitely comes down to conflict and disagreements with people. Because I'm asking questions and always trying to understand where someone comes from, I always potentially give them the benefit of the doubt, even if I should disagree. And I should make that known of, hey, this crossed a boundary, or this wasn't right. Because it's like, I understand where you're coming from, and so I know why you said that, or I know why you did that. So I don't always take the next step of, but hey, that was actually still wrong, and you need to apologize and do X, Y, and Z. And so I definitely have built up a wall of, she doesn't say things about it necessarily, and I guess it would be called more of a doormat, I guess. People can perceive me like that, I generally am just like a
conciliatory? Wow.
Yes, conciliatory. I don't know.
Now
I'm just not going to use the word because I say it and I don't know if I'm saying it the right way or using it I'm using it in the right context.
Yes.
Yeah. I am a mediator and peacemaker and like to resolve conflict between people, but I've kind of built up this thing of like, I don't initiate it myself. And so to your point about sharing emotions and people can look at you like you're aliens, I find that a lot of times the instant I say something and speak up in disagreement and opposition to someone, it can often cause the same reaction of people turn to me of like, oh my gosh, who is this person? I didn't know she thought that or believed that, or did I even know her at all, kind of reaction. And I think another one is that because I'm always trying to ask questions of other people and understand where they are, and you mentioned empathy and emotional intelligence, I'm also sensitive to if other people are having a bad day or what they're feeling. And I'm going to say I don't know if it's a unique thing to me as a polite person, again, but I am just going to speak from my personal experience of my desire is to brighten their day. And so I think for a long time I had built up this person of, it was a combination of both natural, but also it was added to. It wasn't all natural. It was a joyful person who smiles a lot, who just wants to make people happy, who is just always happy. And the truth is, there were a lot of times where I was potentially even having an even worse day than this other person. But it was, the times I had shown that backfired because people actually got mad at me for not being happy and not smiling. And it hurt because it was a moment where I had decided to let my guard down and show that, hey, this is how I'm actually feeling. And I'm actually really stressed and really sad and just not well at this moment, and I need help. And again, not everyone responded in this way, but there were people who were mad and just like, why aren't you joyful? Why are you acting like that? Like, why are you bringing the mood down, kind of a thing. And so my prisons are different and yet similar to yours, and just how I'm wired, and also just wanting to be polite and respectful of other people and being empathetic and trying to understand other people. There are prisons that I definitely build up and that are hard to battle through myself and then change people's perception of me about.
Yeah.
Which is why I say coping mechanisms I think is actually a decent one, because it's like any other coping mechanism habit. It may not actually be the healthy one, but it's comfortable, and so you fall into that and you just do it, and you over and over and over and over again. And so then when you realize, hey, this isn't working, and you have to try and change it, it's a part of it's a process and regular habit of what you do that you're now battling against, and it is almost like you're fighting yourself at times.
Yeah. But to a certain extent, I think there is some benefit that comes from that experience. Once you've developed a self-awareness about it, that's the first step.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding why you do what you do and why it is that you believe that causes those certain actions. And I think there's benefit in that. I know this from you as we've grown, right? And we're still really young and have a lot of life ahead of us. But as we've matured, I think that you've come to recognize a lot more of the pitfalls of politeness. Mm-hmm. And so you're someone who is extremely sensitive to things such as manipulation because you understand yourself. Part of it's personality, part of it is behaviors as a polite person, that you could be very good at manipulation of other people in their feelings and their thoughts and their behaviors. But you refrain from that because, one, as a Christian, right, you're not supposed to do that. That's sinful. But you also understand the devastation that can cause because you see that in other people who are overly polite. So you're aware of the weaknesses of that behavior method, just as someone, as I am with someone who is frank. I see the devastation that someone who's just totally quote unquote honest, how offensive that can be and how many bridges it can burn, like you were saying earlier. Yeah, that sometimes you really just shouldn't say things because it wasn't the right moment. It's the example that popped in my head, right, is if someone loses a family member, it's really insensitive of someone as a Christian to go and say, oh, it's okay, everything works out for the good of those who love God. Like, that is such an insensitive statement to give in that moment. When really the response is just be with that person. Don't say anything unless they express a need or desire.
It's
just
not
be with
them.
them.
Yeah, and it's not that you never reach that answer. If they ask you why this happened, your first response should be, honestly, it should be, I don't know, because you don't know. You don't know what God's plan was and why that had to happen, especially if it's a younger person who died. It's awful. It's horrible, and you want to acknowledge that. But, if they keep asking, once you judge that it's a time that they're going to be receptive and that would actually bring them comfort, then it is God has a plan. God had a plan for this person. They died for a reason, and if you trust God and you are if you're part of his people, he does have a plan for your good, and somehow this is going to be good.
Which, on that note, that would actually start leading us into a solution of acknowledging the humanity on both parties.
Yes.
So, before we get there, though, how about you tell our listeners where they can go follow us and find us and engage in the conversation, and we'll just close this episode out.
Cool. So yes, like I already mentioned, we're on Instagram at Time to Talk, so you can go follow us there. We post pretty much every Monday through Friday, different fun quotes, quizzes, recipes. Obviously, I just mentioned, we'll give you updates on episodes that are coming out, that are out, so definitely go follow us there. You can engage in our comments on those posts. We'd love to know that. DM us if you have questions or comments about things. That would be really fun too. And then we're also on pretty much any podcast platform out there, so Apple Podcast, Google Play Podcast, Google Podcast, wow, Spotify. And I think on most of those you can leave a review, so definitely go do that. We'll look there and see if you've got any questions and things that contributions.
Give us 5
to a
stars, even if it's just out of politeness or because you honestly, as a frank person, believe that we deserve 5 stars.
Yes.
If you don't want to give us 5 stars, just don't give us anything. I'm kidding.
Oh my word. No. Leave us a rating and review. We very much appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I think that's all.
I just said that, very...
I know. I'm sitting here expecting you to close up the episode. Just like, yeah.
Well, because I didn't know... I had something to say and then I decided not to say it.
And now she's going to go feel bad because she didn't say it. I'm joking.
No, I'm not. I'm going to brush that off. I've grown and matured, Grace.
Oh my goodness. No. But that's all for today, so
yeah, and then we'll be back.
Time.
Yeah, we'll be back at some point, like I said, with something around Thanksgiving and then our part 2 of politeness and frankness. But until next time,
cue the cool music.